Study this morning from Matthew chapter 5 and Luke chapter 6. So tonight I'm not going to reread those sections, but these are two parallel passages. Maybe the most well-known phrase from them is Jesus' instruction to love your enemies. And we talked about that some this morning, but really the focus is, at least on the title of it, is just as your Father. And so in Matthew chapter 5, love is the emphasis. In Luke chapter 6, mercy is the emphasis. But what they both share in common is this phrase that these things would be in us and seen from us, just as our Father. And even thinking a little bit more about that tonight, I assume these teachings confront all of us the same way, that these are not easy things to think about, and even more so to apply and to live. The fact that these were among some of the first teachings that Jesus gave shows us Jesus was not trying to market a message and start a following by primarily appealing to what would be popular to people. If you're looking for a way to promote your business, and that these are the terms of membership or the customer base that you're appealing to, kinds of things that Jesus says is not going to have a universal appeal. But of course Jesus knew that, and he acknowledged that in chapter 7, that there's a narrow way and there's a broad way, and he was looking for people who were looking for him. So we're going to build upon the things that we studied this morning, several different areas, and so I've just titled it some additional applications as we study tonight from Matthew 5 and Luke chapter 6. One of the challenges, at least for me in study, and I even remember reading this back in college and trying to wrestle through, work through, so what exactly does this mean? I must do and respond to people who would be an enemy. As I tried to do this morning, that there is balance to this. Jesus is not making us a doormat for the worst of society. And so it's important to recognize that this passage has been abused in a variety of ways, and it's important for us to neither overreact to what Jesus has said as it is that we not underreact. And here's a statement that was made several years ago that I think is pretty representative of how people misunderstand what Jesus was saying. It was said by a politician, or should we just stick to the Sermon on the Mount, a passage that is so radical that it's doubtful our own Defense Department would survive its application? So before we get carried away, let's read our Bibles now. Folks haven't been reading their Bibles, and it was said in a scoffing manner. And so his point is, well, Jesus said, love your enemies. You couldn't even have a government couldn't even exist. That would be self-destructive to a nation. And so the point of this speech, which is not the focus, was that the Bible doesn't really have a place in government. We just have to rule in a way that everybody agrees. Well, is that true? That when Jesus said, love your enemy, that he was saying something that a government could not live according to and could not use? And the answer is no. What Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5 and in Luke chapter 6 about love your enemy and mercy, while he was not giving a detailed government constitution or a detailed approach to the work of a military, if those who are members of a government or a military are seeking to honor God, then they can incorporate everything that Jesus said in this passage. But what Jesus said on a subject like this is not... How did I skip through everything? What Jesus says here is not everything related to the subject of government or the role of military. And in fact, nothing Jesus says here contradicts what the rest of the Bible teaches about the role of government. And so yes, godly leaders could love their enemy, and that doesn't contradict, for example, Romans 13, where we learn that God has appointed the governing leaders to reward those who do what is good and to punish those who do evil, and he does not bear the sword in vain. Jesus was not teaching some kind of governmental passivism that then contradicts what Paul was saying in Romans 13. Just as parents can love their can punish the children whom they love because God has appointed them to that role, a government can love those whom they lead, and even a government could punish those whom they love among them. Punishment doesn't contradict love. Our society, of course, has a very different idea and sentiment about love, but that doesn't contradict it. And so some people have said, well, this just doesn't apply to a government. Well, it applies to every individual in all of his conduct. And while Jesus, again, was not writing a constitution for any nation, what he says doesn't contradict anything else that he said or that the Holy Spirit brought. Likewise, in Luke chapter 6, where Luke records Jesus talking about even lending to your enemy, expecting nothing in return. Well, does that mean that nothing that Jesus says here applies to business or to the role of our work? Well, again, he's not writing the bylaws for a bank or for a business, so he's not talking to a bunch of business leaders. But if someone is trying to run their business or work with their hands in a way that they honor God, then there isn't anything that Jesus says here that would contradict that. What Jesus teaches in Matthew 5 and Luke 6 would not send a company, a business, into bankruptcy if we understand what Jesus is saying. Again, remember that Jesus is not making us a doormat. He doesn't address extreme or unreasonable requests. Remember in Matthew 5 and Luke 6, it's things like a slap, which is an insult, not an attack. It's things like someone wanting to take your garment. He doesn't use the illustration, someone taking your home, taking your family. Someone who compels you to go 1 mile, you go 2, not someone who's going to kidnap you and you just passively have to just hold your hands out and comply. Those are not the kinds of things that Jesus says. And so how would the Sermon on the Mount apply to business? Well, it would, but it's just not all that Jesus says on the subject. What Jesus says does not contradict the whole paragraph of 1 Timothy 5 about providing for our families. And so 1 Timothy 5 verse 8, if any man provides not for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So Jesus isn't saying either to a business or an individual, if someone comes and asks for your life savings, well then they're your enemy and you just give it to them and expect nothing in return. That isn't anywhere in the ballpark of the kinds of things that Jesus is talking about. So maybe that's easily understood, but if you haven't heard or maybe even had a conversation with someone taking this passage of Jesus and trying to say, well, nobody really follows it. Nobody really follows what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, and so nobody really takes the Bible seriously. Don't let scoffers abuse what Jesus is saying, especially when it's obvious that their goal is to deny, not to understand, and not to follow what Jesus is actually saying. Love your enemy does not mean neglect or ignore your neighbor or your friend or your family or the victim of the enemy. That isn't what he's teaching. It's often abused that way. So while it's important we understand what he is saying, it's also important to understand what he is not saying. And one other point along those lines. When Jesus says, love your enemy, that does not mean compromise. It doesn't mean pretend that there are no differences. Jesus doesn't say, love your enemy as though that means join your enemy and become like your enemy, or just pretend that they are not your enemy. Just pretend that they're your friend. Well, no, Jesus says there are enemies, and based on what he says about that, his point is we have to be able to identify our enemies. How are we going to do what Jesus says to do towards our enemies if we just have this pie in the sky idea that everybody just can get along? No, nobody's an enemy. Well, Psalm 1 verse 1. We've got several little ones in here. Know what that says. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. Those would sometimes become your enemy. So Jesus isn't saying, well, just become their friend and walk with them and stand with them and sit with them, go with them wherever they go and do with them whatever they do. No, that's not how you love your enemy. The fact that we do have enemies, Jesus acknowledges, means we've got to identify what makes someone an enemy. Look at John chapter 15 and verse 18. Jesus is preparing the apostles as he was preparing himself for the cross and preparing them. But if up to this point in Jesus' work, his apostles did not yet get the idea that Jesus had enemies and that his enemies would become their enemies, he's preparing them for that. And so John 15 verse 18, if the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. Turn to Luke chapter 6. So God has enemies. And if God has enemies, then we ought to expect to have some. In fact, what Jesus says here in Luke 6:26 is, if we in reality do not have any enemies, then there is a problem. God is probably our enemy. Luke 6:26, woe to you when all men speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets. So maybe we might not realize it, but if we serve the Lord, then if we think of it in that way, then we do have enemies. And so we have to be able to identify who they are. Now then notice the very next verse from verse 26. In verse 27, then that's where we started this morning. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. So we have to know who they are so that we can prepare our heart and prepare our conduct towards them. Love your enemies. Go back to Matthew chapter 5, because I want to notice some other things that Jesus said. We could go throughout his life, but on the very same occasion in which Jesus says, love your enemies, notice some of the other things that he says. And I think we all understand nothing he says within these 3 chapters contradicts anything else. So as I read through these verses, just keep in your mind, love your enemies, and that somehow fits with what Jesus said a few words before those words. Matthew 5 verse 20, for I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of and he doesn't just say the wicked evil people, he names some, the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Was Jesus loving his enemies when he said that? He was. Look at chapter 6 and verse 2. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets. When he says that narrows, he could have just said as the hypocrites. Well, who's the hypocrite? It could be anybody. But he says the ones that carry the trumpets when they go to the synagogue, then that narrows down everybody or some of the people. So I've seen that before. Is Jesus loving his enemy when he says that? He is. In chapter 7 and verse 6, after he has said, love your enemy, he also says, do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you in pieces. Does he love the swine? Does he love the dogs? He does. But he says they'll be your enemy. So prepare yourself for those whom I command you to love. A couple more examples. In verse 15, beware of false prophets. Does he love the false prophets? Well, they are his enemies for sure. He loves them, but he also says, beware of them, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. And then verses 21 through 23, pretty well known, but just read verses 21 through 23 in the context of, love your enemies, do good towards them. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. And so that's one reason we're studying what Jesus said. We want to be the ones who do his will. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? And then I will declare to them whom he loves, to them who have been his enemies, I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Can Jesus say that about his enemies and love his enemies? Can Jesus send these enemies away from him, whom he loves? Is he going to send people he loves away from him into hell? He is. That tells us something about what Jesus is saying of what love is, and even helps us to understand what he meant by, and did not mean by, love your enemies. It's not easy to love an enemy. That requires patient, thoughtful, and a prayerful response to them, not just the impulse, not based on what they have done to us. But responding to an enemy means using truth, not sin. And if we want truth to learn how to how to love our enemy, then we have the best example before us in the teachings of Jesus, who shows us within the very context of love your enemy, what it means to love your enemy, and that does not include any kind of compromise or sin. I touched on this moment. I'm going to just give this a little more thought. How the fact that sometimes our enemies will be those of our own household. Jesus said that in Matthew chapter 10. You remember, I've come not to bring peace but a sword, and to set a father against the son, and a mother against the daughter, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. So that was a little different subject, a little different context, but it sits right beside what we've looked at. Turn to 1 Peter 3. Here's an example of what Jesus was saying in Matthew chapter 10. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. And just as I did a moment ago, as I read this, then keep in the back or the front of your mind, love your enemies, do good to those who spitefully use you and abuse you. 1 Peter 3, verses 1 and 2. Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. This passage is helpful in any culture, in any context, but when you remember the context of 1 Peter, he's writing to Christians who are being persecuted. And that's why back in chapter 2 and verse 13 he says, submit to the government. And in chapter 2 and verse 18, submit to your masters. He's talking to Christians who are suffering by those who are over them. And it's in that flow of context that he says, wives, submit to your husbands who clearly are not Christians. And so, going back to Matthew 5, here's someone who lives with an enemy, is married to an enemy. And so, what should she do? She should love her enemy. Do good to those who spitefully use her. 1 Peter 3 sits beautifully right alongside Matthew 5 and Luke 6, and then it could be applied to any kind of family conflict, or the majority of family conflicts and divisions. Let me turn and read 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8, since I just referenced it and didn't quote the whole verse a moment ago. That again, love your enemy doesn't contradict our responsibility to our family, even when the enemy is in our family. If anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. This is not contradicted by love your enemy. And so, what if the enemy is in my family, and the enemy is going to harm some other members of my family? Do I just have to let them be harmed because Jesus said, love my enemy? Again, that's not the context, doesn't fit at all what Jesus was describing and certainly does not contradict this. Again, Jesus talked about matters of minor loss or insult, but Jesus didn't say, if your enemy, or Jesus said, if your enemy asks for your tunic. He didn't say, if your enemy asks for your child's only tunic, then give it to him and give him your child's cloak also. You see, that isn't what he was saying. Doesn't fit it at all. If your enemy is abusing your child, harming your child's well-being, then you just have to submit. That doesn't fit at all. Do you see the difference? How we can apply what he said in the home, but it doesn't apply to even every kind or form of conflict or wickedness in the home. What Jesus is emphasizing, never retaliation, never revenge. Extend yourself as much as is in you for there to be peace in matters of these of a minor self-sacrifice. That's what Jesus is talking about. Hopefully, the majority of family conflicts are of that source, and not of that sort, and not of some kind that would bring physical harm or even murder within the home. Those would not fit what Jesus is teaching. When our family is our enemy, then Jesus teaches us how to show that we love God first, alongside our love for the enemy. Well, a lot of this has been kind of principles and hypotheticals, but one of the easiest ways to apply what we read in Scripture is to look at examples. And so I thought about, well, who are some people in the Bible who loved their neighbor in the way that Jesus was describing? One of the first ones that came to mind is Joseph. Turn to Genesis chapter 50. And as you're turning, there's certainly a number of examples, aren't there? In fact, as we were just talking about enemies being in your family and in your household, boy, Joseph is the face of that, isn't he? And so Joseph was sold into slavery, and in Genesis 39, he faithfully serves Potiphar. Potiphar, he's just a slave, but he loves his enemy. And then in Genesis 39, Potiphar's wife comes and says, "Come lay with me." And he loves his enemy. He doesn't lay with her, but what he says even has some rebuke. But what he says could have actually helped her when he says, my master has trusted me with everything, and the only thing he has not withheld from me is you. It's a little bit ironic. He goes on to say, because you're his wife, as though she needed to be reminded of that. And then he says, how could I do this great, this wickedness and sin against God? He's loving his enemy. He's loving her in that way. And then he goes in chapter 41 to interpret the dream of Pharaoh. Well, in some way, he could consider Pharaoh to be his enemy, his captor. He was brought there against his will. But then really, of course, beginning in Genesis 42, where the brothers come because of the famine in the family, and they come to Egypt, and Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize him. And then in that story from Genesis 42 through Genesis chapter 50, Joseph uses some caution and he uses some wisdom, but I don't believe there's anything that he does that contradicts love. And then, of course, that's most well represented in Genesis 50, verses 20 and 21. Love your enemy, do good to those who hate you and spitefully use you. Joseph says, but as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day to save many people alive. Now therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Easy to read and pleasurable to read. Not so much to be in that position. But Joseph loved the enemies, including those of his own household. Daniel was another example I thought of, just in the fact that he interpreted the visions. In Daniel chapter 2, he interpreted the vision for King Nebuchadnezzar. Had Nebuchadnezzar been his lifelong friend and companion? No, Nebuchadnezzar had taken Daniel's people into captivity, killed many of them, left some of them there in difficult conditions, brought the others to serve and be the captives of the people of Babylon. And yet Daniel didn't refuse to interpret the dream for him. Daniel loved his enemy. Look at Numbers chapter 14. Moses and most, if not all, of the prophets, whereas Daniel was speaking to the heathen in the dreams that he interpreted, Moses and the prophets were speaking to their own people. And yet usually what was the response of the people to whom the prophets spoke? They usually hated the prophets who spoke. In Numbers chapter 14, God has brought the people of Israel through the wilderness to the border of Canaan. The 12 spies have gone in and come back and given a report. The 10 say, no, we can't go. Joshua and Caleb say, we can. And of course the people say, we can't go. Let's just go back to Egypt. And at the beginning of Numbers 14, the people have said, let's stone Moses, let's stone Aaron, get rid of them, and then let's go back to Egypt. And Moses, read with me verse 19, loves his enemies. He prays to the Lord, pardon the iniquity of this people, I pray, according to the greatness of your mercy, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt even until now. This is like what we're going to read in a few minutes. Moses is saying, Father, forgive them. Even though he was the one, Moses was the one that they hated. And that could be said, again, for the majority of the other prophets throughout the Old Testament. They were loving their enemies by the things that they taught. Well, while Moses didn't use those words, you remember that Stephen did. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen loved his enemies, did good toward those who hated him. As they stoned Stephen, he was calling on and saying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Then he knelt down and cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not charge them with this sin. And when he had said this, he fell asleep. I don't know if Stephen was there when Jesus taught the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know if he heard from those who heard Jesus say that, but somehow Stephen learned that he is kind to the unthankful and evil. Therefore be merciful just as your Father also is merciful. And so Stephen was. And so Stephen was perfect just as his Father is perfect. And so we have these examples for us, but of course we can't talk about examples of this without considering the example of Jesus. Turn to Luke chapter 22. Did you ever consider that not a single miracle that Jesus performed was ever an assault on his enemies? Unless you can think of one, I can't. I don't believe there's any exception to that. He warned them about vengeance and judgment to come, but it was all to come. Jesus waited for that day. Jesus loved his enemies as he went to the Samaritans. The Samaritans hated the Jews hated the Samaritans. But Jesus went to Samaria, where most Jews would not go. But then in Luke chapter 22, love your enemies. Luke 22, verses 49 through 51. When those around him saw what was going to happen, as Jesus was being arrested and betrayed by Judas, they said to him, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, permit even this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Out of all the people and events in Scripture where we wonder, well, I wonder what happened. I wonder what happened to this Malchus. Think that he learned something about what it meant to love your enemy, and I wonder if he ever heard about the Sermon on the Mount. I wonder if anyone ever taught him. Not only does Jesus not call 12 legions of angels, he not only does not retaliate, he also does good towards those in healing the servant. And then in Luke 23 and verse 34, likely what Stephen was recalling in his words. As Jesus was there on the cross, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." Everything that Jesus did, everything that Jesus did not do, everything that Jesus endured was for this purpose. Forgive them. Isn't there so much more to that than the bumper stickers? Be kind, smile, be friendly. Those are nice, but they're often just shallow, foundationless sayings. It'd be good if everybody was kind to each other, but if they did, what would it accomplish? If we're still guilty of sin and we're still sinning, while there are passages that emphasize Jesus' love for his people, Romans chapter 5 and verse 8 paints it in a different way, doesn't it? Romans 5 and verse 8, "But God demonstrates his own love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Can I understand what Jesus meant when he said, "Love my enemies"? If I just continue reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and or John, then I get more than just the hypothetical teaching. I come to better understand it. So then it comes to, will I? Will I love my enemies? Will I love my enemies when I meet people whose political, moral, spiritual, and religious ideas or deeds conflict not only mine, but hopefully if we have to have an enemy, it's because they're conflicting God's ideas and God's teachings. That's when it's difficult. Will I love my enemies and do good towards them when I'm hurt by strangers or friends or family or brethren? And again, I can't list every possible scenario, but I think about there are Christians in Ukraine, there are Christians in Russia, and so what would that mean for them to love their enemies? As I mentioned this morning, we haven't had to live in a time where we've had that kind of enemy, at least in front of us visibly, but people in our nation one day will. It could happen in a few months. It could happen in a few years. It could be a few decades before people of our country would be faced with enemies in that way. But one day, Christians in our country will. It's not a matter of if they will. It's a matter of when they will. It may not be in your lifetime. It might be your children. It might not be your children. It might be your grandchildren. But since it will happen, is your life preparing you to face that? And does your example prepare them to face that? Vengeance is easy, regardless of the enemy. Vengeance is the easiest, at least in the short term. Ignoring the enemy is harder, but loving them and being merciful is most difficult. But of course, what Jesus taught is that's the perfect response, and that's what helps you to understand what God is doing. But then more important, that's what makes you like God. Turn to Matthew chapter 18. As we discussed at length in class this morning, it's a fact that sometimes even my brothers and sisters in the Lord, they will become my enemy. And when I believe that has happened, then loving my enemy becomes, in this passage, very specific. Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. Moreover, if your brother sins against you, then wait for him to come and apologize. No. Go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother. You have loved your enemy, and now he's not your enemy anymore. But if he will not hear, take with you one or two more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. So I won't go back through step by step here, but you could read each step and say, this is how I love my enemy, who is my brother. And if it doesn't go well, if it gets worse, this is how I love my enemy, who is my brother. And if it gets worse, every aspect of what Jesus says here is included. And so, will I? And then last, when I do love my enemy, when I am merciful to the unthankful and to the evil, God can change them. I won't go back and reread 1 Peter chapter 3, but one of the reasons that he tells the wives to submit to their husbands is that maybe without a word, he may be won by your conduct. And so that's certainly not limited to the marriage relationship. This is important because this is what separates love your enemy as Jesus described it in all of the other detail from our society's ideas of be kind, be tolerant. Well, our similarities are greater than our differences, and Jesus loved everyone, and Jesus said love your enemies, and they throw it over like it's a blanket to cover everything. What people who say that will not acknowledge is that when Jesus was saying love your enemies, part of the reason is because if they are enemies of God, they are enemies of themselves. It isn't just that we have a difference. It's that if they really are an enemy of God, and that's why they are our enemy, they are sending themselves to hell. And so, loving my enemy, one of the things it might do is change them. Your love and your mercy can have an impact that you cannot know. When I love my enemies, then God can change others. Maybe it doesn't do anything visibly in regards to the enemy. But if we love our enemies, then we are the light of the world. A city that's set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. We never know the depth of darkness that other people live in or that they have lived in, and how they may observe our response to someone who is our enemy. And the enemy may not change, but maybe someone else will. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. Well, is it worth doing it if it's not going to have any visible change in other people? Remember, Jesus actually doesn't say a whole lot about others in the sections that we read, but here is what is guaranteed to happen. If I love my enemies and all those other things, then you will be perfect. You will be just as your Father in heaven. If you learn to love your enemy, the only result that is guaranteed is that it will change you. Because mercy and love requires patience, and it reminds me not to depend upon my own thinking and my own habits and my own thoughts and my own feelings and what other people did to me. That's just not how I make my decision. And ultimately, it makes me more like God because it helps me to understand God better. God has more enemies on earth than He has friends, doesn't He? And so when I think of God's perspective and the number of enemies and friends that God has, and yet the way that God views and treats the world, well then, when I have my few enemies, then anything that I do, I can understand God has already done, and God continues doing, and even God has done for me. And if that doesn't change me, then I don't know what will. And so, of course, any time that Jesus spoke, we need to understand what He said so that we will do what He said. Of course, any time that Jesus spoke, someone then or today misrepresents what He says, making it sometimes more difficult for us or for others to understand and to know what He did actually say. And so what Jesus said here, we need to read and we need to return to, because We may hear often people talk about what Jesus said, but we need to go back time and again with our own eyes and ears to hear what Jesus said, and to be reminded on this occasion that He tied these things, imitating what God has done, to making us more like God. Who will God prepare to welcome into heaven? It's people who want to be with Him, but also people who want to be like Him, more and more like Him. That's the goal of my lesson. That's the goal, I believe, of Jesus' teaching on this and on all occasions. Are you like Him tonight? In all of our life as a whole, none of us have been. But Jesus came to this earth and not only delivered these words, but delivered up His own life. And then on the first day of the week, Jesus arose from the dead, so that by faith that He is the Christ, we would repent of our sins, and by faith we would confess that faith, and that by faith in the working of God, we would be baptized into Christ, baptized into His death, and then live a new life as He has made us a new creation. Are you persuaded? Or as a Christian, if you have left what your Father offers you, if you need to return to Him tonight, and we can stir you up to do that again, and if we can pray with you, come forward, tell us how we could help as we stand and sing.